When the war ended, German women captured by Allied forces braced for the worst. They had seen destruction, they had lived through fear, and they had been told that the Americans were brutal conquerors. But when the trucks stopped and they stepped into the camps, the first thing that stunned them wasn't cruelty. It was the men themselves. Tall, confident, and calm, the American guards looked completely different from anything they had imagined. As the days passed, those women began to realize that this physical difference was only the surface of something far greater. Stay until the end to discover what they saw, what they felt, and how those encounters forever changed the way they understood their former enemies. When Germany surrendered in 1945, thousands of women who had served the Reich suddenly found themselves prisoners. They were nurses, communications clerks, factory aides, and auxiliary staff attached to Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht units. Many of them were young, barely in their 20s, and for years they had heard only one thing about the Americans: that they were crude, lazy, and incapable of real discipline. For years, Nazi propaganda had described the Americans as weak, lazy, and soft. Yet, when the women were escorted into Allied camps, the guards they met looked nothing like the caricatures they had been shown. Tall, broad-shouldered men in clean uniforms stood at the gates. Their confidence, their calmness, and even their health seemed to come from another world. But when the war ended and they were taken into Allied custody, reality shattered the myth. The first shock came the moment they stepped off the trucks and saw the guards waiting for them. The Americans were enormous compared with the weary German soldiers they had known. Broad shoulders, tall frames, clean uniforms that actually fit. They looked as if they had come from another world. Some of the women whispered to one another in disbelief. After years of rationing and hunger, the physical difference between conqueror and captive was undeniable. Most of these women had spent the last months of the war surviving on watery soup and stale bread. Bombing raids had destroyed rail lines. Rations had shrunk to almost nothing. By contrast, the American soldiers had been eating full meals every day. Meat, fruit, chocolate and coffee shipped across the Atlantic by a supply system that never stopped. When the women entered the camps and saw kitchens stacked with tins of food, they realized how large the gap had become between their world and America's. One former Red Cross nurse later remembered the surreal first evening in camp. The guards passed out bread still warm from the ovens. A truck brought barrels of soup, thick with vegetables and meat. She said that she and her friends were so used to scarcity that they hesitated to eat, afraid it was a trick. But the guards simply waved them forward and moved on to their duties. In the days that followed, curiosity replaced fear. The American guards seemed confident, but relaxed, very different from the rigid, shout-filled discipline of the German army. They walked their patrols quietly, speaking to each other in low tones, sometimes even smiling at the prisoners. To the women, this calm authority was new. They had expected punishment or humiliation, yet what they saw was order mixed with something they could only describe as fairness. Letters and diaries written years later show how the POW women compared everything: the food, the hygiene, even the way the Americans treated one another. In Germany, by 1945, morale had collapsed. People were thin, anxious, and exhausted. Here in captivity, the guards looked healthy and confident. Their boots were polished, their posture straight. They laughed easily. It was, for many prisoners, the first time they had seen what peace and abundance actually looked like. The difference was not just physical, but cultural. The Americans brought with them habits that seemed almost luxurious. They drank coffee at every break. They shared chewing gum and cigarettes with other soldiers. They played music from portable radios and sometimes tossed a magazine or an old newspaper toward the prisoners, letting them glimpse photos of cities untouched by war. Those images of bright lights, smiling faces, cars on wide streets felt unreal to women whose homes in Cologne, Dresden or Hamburg had been reduced to rubble. Inside the camps, the American system of organization impressed even the most skeptical prisoners. Every day had a schedule: roll call, meals, work detail, recreation. Cleanliness was mandatory. The guards inspected living quarters, insisted on washing, and provided real soap, a rare treasure after years of shortages. The women joked quietly among themselves about how meticulous the Americans were, how everything seemed large, efficient, and well supplied. It became clear that this was a country that had never known total destruction. Over time, a strange respect grew between captor and captive. The women were allowed to write letters, to receive Red Cross parcels, and to attend simple educational classes. Some were even paid small wages for their labor in nearby farms or hospitals. The guards maintained strict professional distance, yet they treated the prisoners as human beings rather than enemies. One interpreter recalled how astonished she was when an American sergeant apologized to her after a misunderstanding during roll call. No German officer had ever apologized to a subordinate, let alone to a prisoner. Moments like that stayed with the women for years. As the months passed, many POWs began to compare what they saw in the camps with the propaganda they had been taught. The Americans had been described as decadent, undisciplined, driven by greed. But what they witnessed were young men who followed rules, respected orders, and carried themselves with quiet strength. Their physical size was only the outward symbol of something deeper, a nation that had been nourished not just by food, but by freedom from fear and hunger. When the first groups of women were released and repatriated to Germany, they returned to a homeland that barely existed. Cities were piles of bricks, public buildings were gutted, and families lived in cellars. Many of the returning POWs spoke softly about the contrast they had seen in captivity. They described how the Americans, even in victory, behaved with restraint and decency. For them, that discipline and physical vigor represented a kind of moral strength they had not expected to find in their enemy. Historians later noted that this contrast, the well-fed Allied soldier standing beside a war-worn prisoner, symbolized the true imbalance that had decided the war. The United States had fought with full stomachs, modern medicine and endless resources, while Germany had starved itself in pursuit of conquest. The women who lived through captivity could see that difference in every meal, every gesture, every confident stride of the guards who watched them. Some of those women later emigrated to America during the post-war years. They carried with them a complex mix of memories: loss, humiliation, but also gratitude for the unexpected humanity they had experienced. A few even said that seeing the Americans in those first weeks of captivity changed their understanding of what strength really meant. It was not shouting or cruelty or domination. It was self-control, discipline, and decency. In the end, what began as shock turned into reflection. The phrase they often repeated, "They're a lot bigger than we expected," came to mean more than height or muscle. It became a quiet acknowledgement of a broader truth, that a society built on stability and abundance can grow not only stronger in body, but also in character. When historians study the POW camps today, they often focus on logistics, treaties, or political outcomes. But the memories left by those women tell a more intimate story, one of discovery amid defeat and of respect born from surprise. Their encounter with the American Guards offered a glimpse of how nations differ not only in weapons or armies, but in how they treat the powerless. This is a true story, because sometimes the most revealing moments of history happen not on the battlefield, but behind the barbed wire, where enemies finally see each other as human beings. Do you agree? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more true World War II stories.